There are moments you relive in slow motion. Not because you want to, but because your memory gives you no choice. It comes back with every detail intact, as if it were recorded in high definition, specifically to haunt you when you least need it. I was lying on my back. The apartment ceiling was dark, with just a thin line of streetlights slipping through the crack in the blinds. The apartment was quiet in that very specific 3 a.m. kind of way. A silence so complete that you start hearing things that would normally go unnoticed. The hum of the fridge, someone walking outside on the street, my own heartbeat. And then there was Gabriel's arm, over me, heavy, warm. His entire arm draped across my chest, his fingers resting lightly on my right side. I wasn't breathing right. I was aware of it, but I couldn't change it. Every breath was calculated, careful, as if breathing normally would be too loud, too big, as if any movement could break something fragile and important that was happening in that room at 3 a.m. Gabriel was asleep. Or at least, that's what I was trying to convince myself. Eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, my heart skipping beats, with the arm of a man who had told me about 3 times that he was straight draped across my chest in the dark. And the only thing I could think of was, how did we get here? Because to understand that early morning, you have to understand everything that came before. You need to understand 6 months of 2 strangers learning to share the same air. You need to understand the kind of friendship that grows slowly, and then, all of a sudden, runs so deep, you no longer know what life would be like without it. You need to understand why that arm, on that specific night, was able to change everything. So let me tell you from the beginning, because this story doesn't start on that early morning. It starts much earlier, in the months when I learned to pretend that nothing was happening. I was 22 when I moved to São Paulo. I came from a small town in the countryside, having just landed my first big contract as a freelance designer. A client who paid me enough to make the move, make sense financially, but not enough to afford an apartment by myself in a city that charges per square meter, as if every centimeter were gold. The obvious solution was a roommate. The problem was that I didn't know anyone. It was Mateus, a college friend who had moved to São Paulo 2 years prior, who gave me Gabriel's contact info. Dude, he's great. You'll like him. He needs someone to split the rent after his former roommate moved out. You two are going to get along great. I should have asked what "you two" was based on, because on the phone, Gabriel didn't sound like someone I'd get along with. He was direct, fast, slightly impatient, the kind of person who says, "So it's a deal," before you've even finished processing that you just made a decision. In a 10-minute call, we had agreed on a time for me to visit, the split rent amount, and when I could move in. I knew absolutely nothing about him, other than he was a personal trainer, studied physical education, and that his former roommate had left suddenly, leaving the bills half paid. The first day in the apartment was weird, the way all first days in new places are weird. Everything is unfamiliar, every move you make is hyper-consciously monitored by yourself, trying to figure out which version of yourself you're going to be in this new context. Gabriel helped me carry a few boxes without me asking. He showed me where everything was in the kitchen with the same impersonal efficiency of someone training a new hire. He said, "Let me know if you need anything," in a way that clearly meant, no need to tell me anything, figure it out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of physical presence that takes up space effortlessly. An easy smile, the kind that flashes fast and fades fast, as if he knew he was charming and didn't need to hold it any longer than necessary. Extroverted in that way that sometimes feels performative until you realize it isn't. It's just that he genuinely felt comfortable in the world in a way I never did. I, by contrast, was the kind of person Gabriel probably wouldn't seek out to spend time with. Quiet. I spent most of the day on my computer. I didn't go out to bars. I didn't have much to say about soccer, the gym, or anything that seemed to be my new roommate's natural universe of conversation. We both had completely different routines. He woke up at 5:30 in the morning. I rarely did before 9. He'd get back home at 6 in the evening with energy still to spare. I sometimes barely left the makeshift office in my room on tight deadline days. The first 2 months were functionally cordial. We shared the space efficiently, respected each other's schedules, kept the kitchen reasonably clean. We talked about bills, about who was going to the grocery store, about the leaky faucet in the bathroom. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was just neutral. The way two competent strangers behave when they need to coexist. I remember the exact moment that began to change. It was a Tuesday, almost 2 in the morning. I had just turned in a project that had consumed me for 2 weeks, and I was in that specific state of exhaustion that goes beyond physical tiredness, that mental burnout that keeps you awake even when you're dead tired. I went to the kitchen for some water, and there was Gabriel, sitting on the counter, eating dry cereal straight from the box, staring at nothing. "You can't sleep either?" he asked, as if finding me in the kitchen at 2 a.m. was the most natural thing in the world. "Just finished turning in a project." "Ah." He held out the cereal box toward me. "Want some?" I sat on the counter across from him. We sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that happens when two strangers realize neither of them needs the other to say anything. And then, for some reason I can't quite explain, we started talking. Not about anything important, about the towns we came from. Him from the countryside of Paraná, me from the countryside of Minas. About how different São Paulo is compared to any smaller place. About the way the city swallows you up and spits you back out reformatted, as if it had put you through a giant washing machine, and you came out knowing things you didn't know you needed to know. About the things you lose when you leave the place you grew up, and the things you gain, and how hard it is to tell in the moment if the balance is positive or negative, because you're still in the middle of the process. Gabriel talked about his family in Paraná, with the tone of someone who really loves where he came from, but at the same time knows he doesn't quite fit back in anymore. I recognize that, because it was exactly how I felt about Minas. We spent some time discovering we had more in common than would have seemed reasonable, given how different we appeared on the surface. We stayed up until almost 4 in the morning. The next day, he woke up at 5:30 as usual, and went to work. I woke up at 11, with a new deadline already in my inbox, and that conversation echoing strangely in my head, like when you hear a song for the first time, and it gets stuck in your memory before you even know its name. Not because the conversation itself was extraordinary. It was a late-night chat between two tired strangers in the middle of São Paulo, mundane by any objective metric. It was just that I didn't expect to like the guy so much. That was the beginning. In the months that followed, our friendship formed the way good friendships do. Slowly, without you even noticing it's happening. Until one day, you look over, and the person is there so naturally that you can't even imagine how it was before. Gabriel started telling me about his day while heating up dinner. I started leaving the coffee ready in the morning, because I knew he'd be rushing out and wouldn't have time. Little things. The silent language of two people who have learned to factor each other's existence into their own. And it was in this everyday intimacy that I started to learn Gabriel. Not the Gabriel who appeared on the surface, the effortless extrovert, the guy who could walk into a place and within 10 minutes be chatting with someone he'd never seen in his life. The kind of person who seems to have been born without the shyness gene that makes the rest of us calculate before we speak. That Gabriel I had known since day one. I learned the Gabriel underneath that. I learned that he used humor as a shield, that whenever a topic got too heavy, he deflected with a joke, and the quality of the joke was inversely proportional to how uncomfortable he was. The good jokes, the ones that made me genuinely laugh, were the jokes from when he was comfortable. The bad jokes, the forced ones, the ones that arrived too fast and without context, those were the tell. That was the moment a subject had gotten too close to something he wasn't ready to let anyone touch. I learned that his silence had variations. There was the comfortable silence, the one that happened when we were in the same space, without needing to fill the air with words, watching something, or each in our own corner doing our own things. And this silence was one of the best things I had built in that city. There was the thoughtful silence, which appeared when you said something he was actually considering before answering. And I could spot this one by the way he slightly tilted his head to the side, as if he were internally organizing something. And there was a third silence, a specific one, the kind that appeared when you hit a nerve he preferred to pretend he didn't have. I learned to recognize that one later than I should have, because it took me time to accept that I even wanted to recognize it. I learned that he was genuinely good at listening once you managed to get past the layer of performative extroversion, that underneath it was someone who actually paid attention, who remembered details you'd mentioned weeks before, who asked follow-up questions showing he had actually processed what you said, rather than just waiting for his turn to speak. I learned that when something really worried him, he didn't talk about it. He did more. He'd clean the kitchen, go work out earlier, hold his phone without looking at it. The physical signs of thoughts finding no way out. And I learned, much more slowly and with far more resistance on my part, that I was starting to feel things for him that complicated everything. It wasn't a sudden revelation. It was more like waking up to a noise you only notice after it's been there for a while. You don't know exactly when it started. You just know that now you're hearing it. The signs were subtle, and I catalogued them with the obsessive care of someone simultaneously building a file of evidence and a collection of counter-arguments. Like a scientist collecting data, but who has a personal stake in the outcome, knows it, tries to compensate, and ends up skewing things on both sides at the same time. Gabriel was effortlessly tactile. This ease of contact was just a physical thing with him. He'd squeeze my shoulder when walking through the living room. He'd bump his knee against mine on the couch while watching something. He'd lean close to my computer screen to see something I was describing and just stay there, inches away from me, as if normal social distancing simply didn't exist in his body's vocabulary. There was one afternoon when I was working, and he came up from behind to see what I was drawing. He just stood there, his arms resting on the back of my chair, commenting on the colors. I wasn't processing a word he was saying. I was processing his presence within that perimeter, the temperature, the sound of his breathing, the lingering smell of the gym, because he had only gotten home 20 minutes ago. I was completely paralyzed, and he had no idea. Or he did, and was pretending not to. That was the puzzle I could never quite solve. Counter-argument. He was probably like this with everyone. He's a personal trainer. He spends all day dealing with bodies, with physical contact. For him, touch didn't carry any specific weight. It was just the way he existed in space. To him, it meant nothing. I repeated this counter-argument to myself hundreds of times. Hundreds. But there were other things. Things that were harder to neatly file away. The way he'd lose interest in certain conversations. We were watching TV one night, and a character started talking enthusiastically about his ex-girlfriend, and I noticed that Gabriel was completely disengaged. Not asleep, not distracted, just absent from that conversation in a very specific way, as if it hadn't registered with him at all. I noticed this and filed it away. Maybe he was tired. Maybe the story was boring. Maybe it was anything other than what the part of me that wanted it to mean something was trying to tell me. The time a female coworker of his started texting, and he was showing me something on his phone, and I saw the notifications popping up with her name, and he muted his phone without even glancing at the screen. Later, she sent an audio message, and he listened to it with earphones on a corner of the couch, away from me, and then got really quiet for a while. When I asked if everything was okay, He said, "It's nothing, just work." With that specific tone I had already learned to recognize as, "I don't want to talk about it." And I didn't ask anything else, because part of me didn't want to know the answer, and another part of me thought I already did. The way he talked about past relationships, or rather, the way he didn't. It wasn't that the subject was traumatic or painful. It was more like it was irrelevant, as if he were describing a period of life that belonged to someone else, without the kind of nostalgia or resentment people usually carry when they talk about an ex. I catalogued all of this, and then I built a counter-argument for every item on the list. The look. This one I tried to ignore more than any other sign, because it was the most ambiguous and the easiest to chalk up to my own projection. But there were moments mid-conversation, during dinner, when he was telling me something, and I let out a genuine laugh, where Gabriel would look at me for just a second longer than necessary. Not in an obvious way. Not in a way I could point to and say, that was intentional. Just an extra second, as if he had briefly paused on something before moving on, as if there was a thought he had and discarded before it could turn into words. I would invent a logical excuse before the sign even finished forming. I'm seeing what I want to see. He's straight. He's always been straight. He never said anything, never did anything. I'm projecting. But there's one thing the brain can't do efficiently: manufacture justifications for what the body feels. You can convince the mind. The heart doesn't give you that option. And then, one night in June, I could no longer ignore what I was feeling. We had watched a long movie, some action flick Gabriel had picked out that was exactly the kind of thing I wouldn't normally choose. But I had watched it without complaining, because sitting on the couch with him in the dark living room at 10 o'clock at night was one of the places I felt most comfortable in the world, and that, in itself, told me everything I needed to know and was refusing to hear. The movie ended. Gabriel yawned, stretched, stood still for a moment staring at the blank screen, and then got up saying, "Well, early day tomorrow." He ran his hand through my hair as he walked by, something he did sometimes, that kind of casual, almost brotherly gesture, and went to his room. I sat there on the dark couch for about 20 minutes. I was in love with him. I was in love with my straight roommate, and that was absolutely the last thing I needed to be true. Because Gabriel was the only genuine friendship I had built in this new city. He was the person who made me feel like São Paulo wasn't as big and lonely as it seemed. He was the only place I felt at home in a city that wasn't exactly my home yet. And I was going to lose all of that if I couldn't keep what I was feeling hidden very, very well. So that's what I decided to do. Keep it to myself. Do nothing. Just carry on as we were. Friends, roommates, two people sharing the same apartment who, by some happy accident, had discovered they genuinely liked each other. It was a reasonable plan. The couch broke on a Thursday. One of the front legs just gave out while I was sitting on it, watching something on my computer. The couch didn't collapse entirely. It just tilted to one side, leaning in a precarious position that was still usable if you sat on one end and didn't make any sudden movements. Gabriel and I assessed the situation together that night. Buying a new couch was out of both our budgets at the moment. He had just paid for some expensive college materials, and I had a month of heavier than usual bills. We could get it fixed, but the repair would take a week. "I see two options," Gabriel said, arms crossed, staring at the couch like he was analyzing a workout strategy. "Either we live without a couch for a week, or one of us sleeps in the other's bed." My bedroom had a twin bed, small, narrow, the kind that makes it hard to sleep comfortably, even for just one person. Gabriel's room had a full-size bed, bought by the previous roommate, who had moved out and left it behind because it was too big to move. The obvious solution was for me to move to Gabriel's bed. It was just logic. I spent the next 5 minutes trying to find a flaw in that logic with the urgency of an engineer spotting a structural defect right before a rocket launch. "It's just for a week," Gabriel said, with the casualness of someone for whom this was absolutely nothing more than a practical matter. "The bed is big enough. We each stick to our own side. We won't even notice." Sure, each to our own side. A practical matter, without any implications whatsoever. "All right," I said. The first night was exactly the discomfort I expected, only multiplied by a factor I hadn't been able to accurately calculate. I lay as close to the edge of my half as I could without falling off. Gabriel stayed on his side, facing the wall, and within 10 minutes, he was asleep. I could hear it in his breathing, in the way his body relaxed. I stayed awake for an hour and a half, categorizing the distance between my ribs and his side of the mattress, like it was critical information. There was a massive sensory difference between knowing Gabriel was in the next room and knowing he was 2 feet away from you. His body heat was noticeable even without contact. His breathing was a sound I had never heard from this close. I had a constant awareness of exactly where he was, as if my nervous system had decided this information was a top priority and insisted on giving me real-time updates. I fell asleep around 2 in the morning. I woke up at 7 to Gabriel already up and making noise in the kitchen. "Morning," he said when I walked in, as if the night before had been completely mundane. To him, it had been. The week passed. The couch was fixed, and it returned to the living room. We went back to our separate bedrooms, but it wasn't the last time, because the repaired couch lasted exactly 18 days before it gave out again, this time one of the back legs, and now both our budgets were even tighter, and the conversation about buying a real new couch led to the conclusion that spending a few more weeks sharing the bed was more practical than spending money neither of us had. "Until we find a decent couch on Craigslist," Gabriel said, like it was simple, and it was simple for him. I realized this with a bleak sort of clarity. So the weeks began, and something happened that I didn't expect. The body adapts. It's almost disturbing how quickly the extraordinary becomes ordinary when you're exposed to it often enough. After 1 week, I wasn't staying awake for an hour and a half categorizing distances anymore. After 2, I was falling asleep within a reasonable time frame. After 3, there were nights when I fell asleep before Gabriel, and woke up the next day realizing I didn't know what position I'd spent the night in, which was simultaneously a relief and a brand new source of anxiety. What didn't change was the awareness. That remained. It just grew familiar, like background noise you learn to live with, instead of trying to eliminate. Like a device on standby that you know is plugged in, even when it's not visibly doing anything. There was something specific about the dynamic of sharing sleep with someone. Not sleep itself. Sleep was rest. It was the boundary between waking and sleeping. Those 20 minutes of degraded consciousness right before you actually drift off, when the filter you use all day to behave reasonably starts to weaken. It's when you move in ways you didn't choose to. It's when your body does what it wants instead of what you decide. And with it came changes that I registered, but preferred not to analyze too closely. Gabriel had stopped strictly maintaining the each to our own side rule. Not in an obvious way. He wasn't crossing the bed. There was nothing I could point to as deliberate. But I woke up some mornings with less space than there should have been. He sometimes woke up closer than he'd been when he went to sleep. Sleep movements, I told myself. It's completely normal. The body moves during the night. We both move. This means absolutely nothing. And it was during this time, in those weeks of calculated distance, that kept shrinking inch by inch, without either of us making the conscious decision to shrink it, that the most dangerous thing happened. It started feeling normal. There was one night, about 10 days before the early morning, that changed everything. when we were talking in the dark before going to sleep. This had become a casual habit. The lights out, each in our own corner of the mattress, and sometimes the day's conversation would continue for a few more minutes before the silence of sleep. That night, Gabriel was telling me about a student who had dropped out in the middle of the program, and in the middle of the story, he went quiet for a while and then said, "Do you think there are people who never discover who they really are?" It was a strange question for the context. It came out of nowhere. "I think so," I said. "Why?" Silence. That specific silence of his, the one I had already learned to recognize. Then, nothing. Nonsense. Good night. I stayed awake for a long time after that. Winter deepened. São Paulo doesn't have a postcard perfect winter. It doesn't snow. It doesn't have all that dramatic flair. But it does have that damp chill that seeps into your bones in the morning and at night, making another person's body heat seem necessary in a way that's hard to rationalize as purely physiological. The apartment didn't have decent heating, and we had started sleeping with more blankets than usual. On the night in question, the cold had been particularly bad. São Paulo has a specific kind of cold deep in the winter. Not dramatic, not snowy, but the kind that clings to the humidity in the air and makes the temperature feel lower than the thermometer suggests. The apartment didn't have central heating, just an old electric heater in my room that made too much noise and gave off little heat. I remember that we closed all the windows before going to bed, that I grabbed an extra blanket from the closet, that both of us made some generic comment about how freezing the night was before turning out the light. Gabriel fell asleep fast. I heard his breathing change. I knew that transition after weeks of it, the exact moment his body stopped being tense and became heavy in that specific way of sleep. I stayed awake for about 20 minutes, my feet cold even with socks on, the blankets taking time to warm up. I thought about trivial things, the project I had to deliver the following week, the sporadic street noise outside. Eventually, the warmth of the blankets set in, my thoughts grew sluggish, and I fell asleep. I don't know exactly what time it was when I woke up. I know it was dark. The line of street light on the blinds was there, faint as always, and the apartment had that silence that only exists in the early hours of the morning when the entire city is sleeping and even the cars stop passing by. The kind of silence that makes your own breathing audible. And I was in a different position than when I had fallen asleep. There was an arm over me. It took me a few seconds to process it. The kind of processing your brain does when reality doesn't match the file of possibilities it was expecting. That fraction of a second of recalibration before understanding what is happening. Gabriel's arm was draped over my chest, heavy and warm, his fingers resting loosely against my side. I stayed motionless. My heart started racing in a completely involuntary way, the kind of physical response the body executes before you have any chance to intervene. I took a deep, slow breath, trying not to make a sound. My first thought was completely rational. He's asleep. It's a reflex. This happens. It doesn't mean anything. If I move, I'll wake him up, and it's going to be awkward. It's best to stay quiet and let him move on his own. My second thought wasn't quite so rational. I counted the seconds. 5, 10, 15, 30. Gabriel was completely still. The steady breathing of someone asleep, or of someone who's very good at faking it. I couldn't tell the difference. I knew his sleep rhythm. I had months of reference, and this sounded just like any normal night. The arm was there. I was pinned underneath it. The apartment was completely silent. And then his fingers moved. It wasn't the random twitch of a muscle during sleep. It wasn't the involuntary contraction of someone turning over. It was a squeeze. Deliberate, brief, like the gesture of someone purposely holding another person's hand and then loosening their grip. Gabriel's fingers squeezed my side unmistakably, and then returned to their previous stillness. Time stopped. That's not a metaphor. It's the most accurate description I have for what happened in my nervous system at that moment. Everything slowed down to a near halt, as if my brain had decided it needed to process that with all its available capacity and couldn't waste resources on anything else. My breathing, the temperature of the room, the weight of his arm, the exact location of his fingers, the duration of the squeeze, what came before, what would come after. Gabriel didn't move. He remained motionless, his breathing steady, his arm right where it was. I just lay there staring at the ceiling. The mind does interesting things when you're paralyzed in the dark at 3 a.m. with your heart in your throat and the urgent need to understand what's happening. It goes in every direction all at once, with no hierarchy, no filter. Every thought arrives with the same urgency, and not a single one can finish a sentence before the next one interrupts it. I caught myself replaying the last 6 months with a level of attention I had never allowed myself before. Every signal I had catalogued and filed away with counter-arguments. Every moment I had dismissed as projection. Every look that lingered a second too long. Every silence that had a different texture from the rest. Every touch I had rationalized as the habit of someone who works with bodies all day long. That entire collection of moments I had denied myself the right to consider it was all there, accessible, out of order, defying logic, like slides from a scrambled presentation that suddenly made a different kind of sense. And at the same time, the other side of my brain, the one that always had more practice protecting me from myself, was building the opposing argument in real time. He's sleeping. It's an involuntary movement. He doesn't know what he's doing. In 15 years of friendships with physically expressive people, no one ever thought twice about a sleepy squeeze. You're turning a muscle reflex into a narrative because you want it to be a narrative. And then I thought, but what if it's just sleep? What if he's actually sleeping? What if I wake up in the morning and he acts like nothing happened because, to him, nothing did? That possibility was almost worse than the alternative. Because in that scenario, the only one who had been awake that night turning a reflex into an event was me. And I'd have to keep sharing that bed without anything having changed, except that now, I knew the exact extent of what I was capable of feeling. I stayed awake. Gabriel's arm stayed right where it was. Sometimes I tried to focus on something else. I counted breaths. I methodically tried to relax every muscle in my body, things that usually work when you can't sleep. Nothing worked. I was hyper-aware of every millimeter of that contact, of every passing second, of the chill of the apartment that felt increasingly trapped beneath the covers, making the warmth of Gabriel beside me something I didn't want and couldn't help but want at the very same time. The window brightened imperceptibly. The sliver of streetlight on the blinds became less necessary as dawn slowly began to take shape. That grey hour before actual daylight, when everything is in low resolution, as if the world wasn't quite awake enough yet to be fully in focus. Gabriel's arm was still there. I knew, in that moment, with a certainty that was both calm and terrifying, that after tonight, something would have to change. I didn't know what. I didn't know how. I didn't know if it would be me saying something, or Gabriel saying something, or if the silence would just stretch on indefinitely until one of us could breathe normally again. But something was going to have to change. Gabriel woke up. When I say he woke up, I mean he went through the process of waking up in a way that someone who hadn't spent 6 months learning his sleep patterns wouldn't have recognized as performative. It was too gradual, too deliberate, the kind of awakening from someone who had already been awake for a while and was just picking the right moment to acknowledge it. The arm withdrew a smooth motion, as if he had simply rolled over onto his side. By the time I woke up, or went through the motions of pretending to, he was already on the other side of the bed, scrolling through his phone with his back to me, his arm completely pulled back. "Morning," he said without turning around. "Morning," I replied. Everything was normal, completely normal. The kitchen was an exercise in collaborative performance. Two actors who know their lines, know their roles, and deliver the scene with technical competence. Gabriel cracked jokes. He always made jokes in the morning. It was almost a reflex, the lightness of humor serving as a first layer of defense against the world before coffee. I answered back. We talked about our day. He had practice until late. I had a video call with a new client. The conversation was exactly what it always was. And that's what hurt me more than any silence ever could. I only started noticing the cracks because I was looking for them. The way Gabriel avoided eye contact in very specific ways. Not obviously, not like someone ignoring you, but with the quiet caution of someone who knows exactly where you are and is calculating how not to look directly at you. The joke that landed a second too early in response to a silence that hadn't quite settled yet, filling a void before it even existed. That moment in the kitchen. I was grabbing a mug from the cabinet, and he was turning to grab something from the other side, and for a fraction of a second, we stood frozen in the same tight spot in the kitchen, way too close for the casual morning ritual we'd always shared. Gabriel immediately took a step aside, forcing a natural vibe, and moved to the counter across the room. That single step told me everything the last few hours hadn't been able to say for sure. The day was long and completely useless. I tried to work. I opened the new client's project, made some typography choices, stared at them for 20 minutes without really seeing them, and closed the program. I reopened it, closed it again. I went to make coffee at 11 in the morning, when I'd already had 2 cups. I stood by the window, looking out at the street for no particular reason. The early morning hours played on a loop in my head, with a precision I hadn't asked for and couldn't turn off. The squeeze of his fingers, the deliberate, brief, undeniable squeeze, the calculated withdrawal of his arm in the morning, too smooth to be casual, the sidestep in the kitchen, that half step of someone who knows exactly where you are and is consciously managing the distance, and the joke that landed too early, filling a silence before it could even form. The bad joke, the kind of joke made when the topic had gotten too close to something he wasn't ready to let be touched. I had learned to read Gabriel's silences. I learned to read the jokes. I learned to read the sidesteps. I just didn't know what to do with what I was reading. That night, Gabriel said he was going to a friend's house. He hadn't been to a friend's house in weeks. We had fallen into a rhythm of nights at the apartment, eating dinner while watching something, talking in the dark before falling asleep, and he was deliberately breaking that rhythm. I knew it. He knew that I knew, and neither of us said a word. "That's fine," I said. "Go ahead." I stayed alone in the apartment. The silence was different when he wasn't around, heavier, more honest in a way that wasn't comfortable. I sat on the fixed couch that wasn't really fixed and stared at the wall for an amount of time I couldn't track. There was a decision taking shape. It wasn't a decision I wanted to make. It was easier to keep things as they were, to carry on with the silence, to keep pretending that nothing had happened, and that we were both fine, and that the friendship would remain intact, and that eventually things would go back to their previous state of balance, if that state had ever really existed at all. It was so much easier to pretend. But I had spent the last few months pretending, and the bill was coming due either way. It was late when Gabriel got back. I was awake, not on the couch. I had gone to my room but hadn't been able to sleep. I heard the key in the lock, the footsteps in the hallway. There was a pause before his bedroom. I could picture him standing there, noticing the light under my door. I stepped out of my room. He was in the hallway, jacket still on, keys in hand. He looked at me with an expression that was very hard to read. Not exactly surprise, not exactly resignation, something in between that I didn't have a name for at the time. "Hi," he said. "Hi." I went to the living room. I sat on the couch. He stood still for a second and then followed. But not to the couch. He went to the armchair next to it, a gesture I registered but didn't comment on. We sat in silence for a while. The kind of silence that exists when two people know what the conversation needs to be, and neither wants to be the first to start. I started. "Were you asleep?" The question came out simple, direct. No accusation, no drama. It was literally the only thing I needed to know in order to move on. He was asleep. It was a reflex. It didn't really happen. I can file this away, under weird, unexplained moment, move on. Or he wasn't, and then we needed to talk about what that meant. Gabriel stayed quiet. It wasn't a thoughtful silence. It was the silence of someone weighing two options, knowing that either one comes with a cost he isn't sure he can pay yet. "I was," he said. I didn't say anything. I waited. "I was asleep," he repeated, with less conviction than the first time, as if hearing his own words and realizing they weren't holding up. "Gabriel." He closed his eyes for a second. When he opened them, there was something different in his expression. That layer of distance he used to keep himself neutral had dropped a little. "I know it's not what you want to hear." "I don't know what I want to hear. That's why I'm asking." More silence. He placed his keys on the coffee table with a soft clink and kept looking at them as if they were a necessary focal point. "I don't know how to explain it," he finally said. With a raw honesty, I wasn't expecting, not the dramatic declaration I had been imagining all day, but something smaller and truer than that. "I don't have the right words. Try with the ones you have." He stayed quiet for a while. When he started talking, it came out in pieces, uncomfortable, intermittent, with pauses where he was clearly searching for a vocabulary he had never needed to have. The language for the feelings he was trying to describe simply wasn't part of the language he had been raised to communicate in. There were things he thought about. He didn't know for how long. Maybe weeks, maybe more. Maybe he had always had these thoughts, but had spent his whole life pushing them into a place where they didn't need a name. Thoughts that would pop up, and he would discard before finishing forming them, because discarding them was simpler than knowing what to do with them. Because if you don't finish forming the thought doesn't exist. And if the thought doesn't exist, you don't have to deal with what it implies. With me, it was different. He said this with the tone of someone handing over a piece of information he knew was important, without yet knowing what to do with that importance. He didn't know what it meant, this difference. He didn't know how to name it. He grew up in a family where some conversations simply didn't happen, where there was a complete vocabulary for certain things and an absolute silence for others, and he had absorbed that map without questioning it, because he'd never had a reason to question it. I had used "I'm straight" my entire life as a statement that didn't need to be tested, as an obvious fact of nature, like "I'm tall" or "I'm from Paraná," something you say because it has always been true and therefore requires no verification. I had never needed to examine it closely. I had never found a reason to ask if it was actually true or just the most convenient statement available. And now, I didn't know what a fact was anymore. He said it without looking at me. The keys were left on the table, and he was staring at them, with the voice of someone saying out loud something they've never said before, hearing how it sounds for the first time, not yet knowing what that sound means to them, but knowing that something has changed simply by having said it. I didn't say anything. I didn't try to label what he was feeling. I didn't offer words. I didn't say, "This is what you are," or The name for this is such and such, or any of the things people sometimes say when they want to help, but which, in that moment, would have been wrong. Gabriel didn't need me to solve this for him. He needed space to say what he was saying, and someone to just be there listening without running away. So I stayed. I listened, without backing away an inch. I don't know how much time passed. At some point, Gabriel stopped talking, not because he had finished everything there was to say. Clearly he hadn't. But because he had reached the limit of what he could articulate that night. He had reached the edge of the vocabulary he had available for this, and beyond that edge was only a silence that wasn't empty, but which he had no way of filling with words he hadn't yet learned. The living room was quiet. The small lamp in the corner created that specific quality of light that happens late at night when you don't want to turn on the main light. Not because the main light is bad, but because that dimness had the right texture for the kind of conversation that was taking place. I realized, at a certain point, that neither of us had sat on the couch. We were both on the floor. I had slid off the couch at some point without noticing. Gabriel had crouched down from the armchair at some point while he was talking. It was a small and significant detail at the same time. Neither of us had gone to the comfortable spot. We had both gotten down on the living room floor, as if the weight of honesty required a more solid foundation, as if the distance from the furniture was too great for that conversation. "I'm scared," he said. Not of me, not of the conversation itself, of himself, of what he was discovering by putting it into words, of what those words said about everything he had built as his identity over 25 years, of the fact that he didn't know what to do with what he was feeling, of the distance between who he had been until that night and who that conversation was suggesting he might be. "I know," I said. And then, without either of us clearly taking the initiative, without a defined moment of transition, the conversation stopped being about that specific night and started being about us in a broader sense. What I felt, which I said, for the first time out loud, without rationalizing as I spoke, without building the counter-argument in the exact same sentence that I was building the statement. I said, I was in love with him. Not in those exact words, but in words that meant the same thing, and hearing the sound of them was strange and necessary at the same time, like lifting a weight you've been carrying for so long, you forgot you were carrying it. What he didn't know, he felt, but knew existed, that there was something different, something he couldn't name with his available vocabulary, but that had been there long enough for him to know it was real. The shared fear of losing what we had between us, if this went too far. The friendship, the time spent together, the person who had become more familiar than anyone else in that city. The fear that naming something could destroy what didn't have a name but was working. And the other fear, the opposite and equally real, of pretending nothing had happened and staying forever in that limbo where neither of us could be completely honest, where every conversation had a second layer that neither of us acknowledged out loud. That night, we didn't resolve anything. There is no clear resolution for questions that have spent years being suppressed and that you are confronting for the first time, sitting on your living room floor in the middle of the night with the person the questions are about. We didn't walk away from there knowing what we were. We didn't make grand declarations. There wasn't that cinematic moment that, if it were a movie, would be the central scene the trailer would use. But we stopped pretending, both of us, at the same time, in that room. And it was much more important than any conclusion we could have reached that night. That was a few months ago. I told you at the beginning of this story that there are moments you relive in slow motion. And it's true. But what I didn't know, that early morning lying in the dark with my breath caught in my throat, was that not all these moments are the kind that haunt you. Some are the kind you revisit on purpose, not because you can't stop, but because you want to remember what it felt like to be at the beginning of something. Things weren't simple after that. It would be a lie to say they were, that we woke up the next day knowing everything, that the clarity of a conversation resolved the complexity of a lifetime of identity that someone had built and never questioned. There were complicated weeks. There were days when Gabriel would fall silent in a way I couldn't read, and I would be left wondering if he was processing or pulling away. There was one night when he said he needed time, and I didn't know what to do with that, other than to say, "That's okay," and genuinely try to mean it. There were days when either of us could have pulled away, when it would have been easier to return to the silence, to our strictly demarcated halves of the bed, to the manageable distance that had been our default for so long. Pulling away is always the easier option. Always. Because silence demands nothing of you. It demands no vocabulary. It demands no courage. It doesn't demand that you accept the possibility of losing something that matters. But we didn't pull away. What happened between us, what is still happening, doesn't fit into a clean definition. And a part of me thinks it's okay that it doesn't. Gabriel is still discovering things about himself that take time to process. And I've learned that discovering your identity doesn't run on a schedule determined by the comfort of whoever is waiting on the outside. I wasn't the one who figured it out for him, and it wasn't my role to do so. It wasn't my identity to figure out. Everyone finds their own vocabulary at their own pace, and the only thing in my control was to just be there, unhurried, while it happened. What changed in me goes beyond Gabriel. It has to do with what I learned about myself throughout this whole story, about my specific habit of loving in silence, out of fear of losing what I already had, about the pattern I can identify now, looking back. I walked into that apartment already willing to protect the friendship before it even existed, already building the framework of denial before I had anything to deny, as if precaution were a way to avoid taking a risk. About the narrative of denial that I built for months with the care of an architect, every counter-argument slotted into the right place, every signal filed away under the safest interpretation available. About how much mental energy I spent trying not to feel what I was feeling, and about how much clarity I lost because of it. About what it means to stop asking for permission to feel what you feel. I spent a long time inventing reasons to invalidate my own emotions, as if feeling were a hypothesis that needed to be tested and validated before being accepted as a given. As if what I was experiencing needed external confirmation to be real, as if the reality of a feeling depended on whether the other person reciprocated or not. That early morning, and everything that came after, was the point where I stopped demanding that of myself. Not perfectly, not in a single definitive decision, but I started. And something shifts when you start. We still live in the same apartment. The couch was finally replaced. We found a decent one on Facebook Marketplace for a price that didn't break the bank, and Gabriel spent 2 hours putting it together while I tried to help without getting in the way. And we both ended up on the floor with the instructions scattered, laughing at something I can't even remember anymore. The new couch isn't going to break the same way the old one did, but if it breaks, it will have a different story. The practical logic of sharing Gabriel's bed ceased to exist as an excuse. But things are different in a way I wouldn't try to describe in words that are too clear, because part of what they are exists precisely in the space between what is said and what doesn't need to be. What I do know is that we both stopped pretending, and that this, which might seem like too small a starting point for everything that led up to it, 6 months, a shared bed, an arm in the dark, a squeeze of the fingers that lasted 2 seconds, was actually the most important thing. Sometimes I walk past Gabriel's room and think about that early morning, the bed in the dark, his arm over me, the fingers that moved with intent, and then stayed completely still, as if the gesture hadn't happened. it's no longer a memory of panic. It's no longer the memory of a racing heart or of counter-arguments built at 3 in the morning. It's the memory of the moment when something started to become real. And that, in a way I couldn't have imagined, at 3 in the morning staring at the ceiling with my fists clenched in tension, not knowing if the squeeze of his fingers had been real or a projection, not knowing if the morning was going to be awkward or ignored or the beginning of something that didn't even have a name yet, is enough. Sometimes, enough is the most precise thing there is. If you've been following this channel and this story resonated with you in some way, if you've also loved someone in silence, if you've also spent hours lying in the dark looking for rational excuses to ignore what your own heart was telling you, if you've also pretended to be asleep so you wouldn't have to deal with what you were feeling, know that you're not alone. This is the conversation this channel exists to have. Leave a comment telling me what you thought, what touched you, what made you recognize something in yourself. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is where we continue.